Okay, here we are, late 19th century. Japan has opened up in 1868 to the world under the Meiji governance. It learns a few things. It has an interesting government plan here to try to make this transition to be a modern, powerful state and not become one of the large quantity of servile states serving Western imperialism. And so the Japanese realize a few things that you want to take note of as it tries to transition from essentially feudalism in the 19th century to industrial capitalism in the 20th century. All right, here are some critical realizations by the Japanese. Now, first off, what Japan realized is that it needed to be the consumer of raw materials and not the producer of raw materials. You definitely want to be the consumer of raw materials and not the producer of raw materials. The consumer of raw materials are what you call today underdeveloped states. All right, excuse me, scratch that. The producer of raw materials that you see today are generally speaking what you call an underdeveloped economy. What you want to be is the consumer of raw materials. Say the United States buys tons of raw materials, and then, of course, it takes those raw materials and turns them into a product, and these days into a high-tech service, all right, using the raw material of high-skilled labor. But another matter. In other words, as I've written here, Japan wants to be like the emerging developed countries of the Western Europe and North America. Japan needs to be a country that manufactures goods that are comprised of raw materials and not a country that supplies raw materials to manufacturing countries. Again, that's an underdeveloped country. As I've put on there, international power in the 20th century was based on the industrial manufacturing of products. If you produce products of greater value because you integrated raw materials and you added expertise and skilled labor and capital investment, what you get is a product that generates more wealth. More wealth means, well, more wealth because it's a higher price, but more wealth means you can afford the implements necessary to coerce other countries, both politically and militarily. That's what the developed world is. And Japan said it wanted to be a consumer of raw materials, not the producer of raw materials. All right. The problem is, if Japan wants to be a producer of raw material, a consumer of raw materials, as I've already noted, Japan has very poor natural resources at home. And so Japan wants to be a major manufacturing country. It wants to be part of the developed world. That means it needs to gain access to raw materials abroad. It doesn't have them domestically. It's fantastic if you're like the United States, where you want to be a manufacturer consuming tons of raw materials, and you've got tons of raw materials in your home country. Japan has no real natural resources, industrial resources to feed into an industrial base. All right. So Japan decides to embrace the outside world during the Meiji period, and the key thing is that Japan says, look, we need to mimic various institutions of the West, especially the ones that will allow us to become a manufacturing power. And the result was the Iwakura mission. This was literally a diplomatic embassy sent from Japan in 1871, and the purpose was that this embassy was dispatched. It took 2 years. It was going to circumnavigate the world and go to the major power centers of the Western world. And the express purpose of the Iwakura mission was, as I've written over here, it was to traverse the world to gather information on education, on culture, on military, on technology, social and economic structures, get all this information from the outside world that they visited in order to affect the modernization of Japan. Japan was going to shape herself as rapidly as possible on successful Western models. And there are numerous examples of this, but let me give you some high-profile ones. If you wanted to have a modern navy, which of course was how power is principally projected in the 19th and 20th century, military power anyway, the British were the most successful in the 19th century, and therefore they went to the British. And they decided to shape their, or forge their navy on a British model of command and control. And a lot of the British military naval infrastructure would be mimicked by the Japanese because the British were the most successful at that. If you wanted to have an army in the late 19th century, the Germans were particularly successful. In the late 19th, Germany would come into existence in 1871 after some magnificent landed battles or wars that they established. Therefore, the Japanese went to the Germans to make a military that was largely forged on German lines. And of course, I can assure you the British and Germans and other countries, including the United States, everybody wanted to get into Japan and to provide these services. Not only can you charge to provide these services for Japan, but you can also secure contracts to provide finished products, especially military products, amongst others to the Japanese. So you can understand how the British and the Germans and the United States and other countries want to get into Japan because it's a great economic opportunity. Now, if you wanted to have, you need to establish a capitalist form of economic practice out of the feudalism that existed in the 19th century. They decided to go with the German model. And there are many forms of capitalism. Never think that capitalism is a simple structure. There are many ways of practicing it. The German model particularly had an interesting feature that it used cartels. And cartels are essentially a bundling of economic producers working together to produce a product, if you would, or working in conjunction with other producers of the same product because it was more efficient to do so, and it could give strategic advantages domestically and certainly internationally. The U.S., by and large, doesn't like cartel economic production, although your educational system here is formed on cartels, University of Texas system and things like this. But economically speaking, the United States finds this problematic. I don't know why, but people think there are rules in capitalism. There aren't any, in any case. We generally don't like to see cartels in the United States. Now, you needed a modern governmental structure. You can't just use the old feudal system. And so they decided to come down as a choice between the British system and the American system. The American system you're familiar with. You have three equal main features, right? You've got the judiciary, you've got the legislative branch, Congress, and then you've got the executive branch, the presidency. Or you could go with the British system. The British system has at the bottom, a House of Lords. On top of that, at the bottom, a House of Commons. On top of that, you have a House of Lords, and on top of that, you have the figurehead of the monarch. They decided to go with the British system. Why? Because the British system allowed for a monarch, and the Japanese, as a national symbol, wanted to keep the emperor. And the British system allows that. The American system does not. The British system allows for the House of Lords, the old aristocracy. Well, the United States system doesn't do that. In practical terms, the United States doesn't do that. In technical terms, the United States doesn't do that. But anybody looking at the wealth that you find in the Congress would have to bring a substantial amount of scrutiny to that statement. Nevertheless, on paper, we are not supposed to have a hierarchy between these houses, the Congress and the Senate. It's not supposed to correspond to wealth between the Senate and the House of Representatives. In any case, another matter. They decided to use the British parliamentary system, as you can see, and I've written down over here. This is clearly an example of Japan trying to westernize itself in an extremely short amount of time. The most important realization, arguably, is that the Japanese realized they needed to have a Western-style economy. A Western style economy meant that you were an industrial producer of goods. And therefore, what that means, they needed to have a foreign policy that was also Western, because Western foreign policy in the 19th century was all about expansion for empire, for the express purpose, as you've seen in sub-Saharan Africa, as you've seen in South Asia already. Western foreign policy was oriented towards establishing resource peripheries, to establish colonies that supplied raw materials to the industrial base in Europe. The Japanese realized they had to do the same thing. If they were going to mimic the West and have a Western-style economy, they were also going to have Western-style imperialism. And so Japan instantly shifts to become a militarily aggressive state, as indicated by the changing ensigns, the rising sun here. In any case, and the result is all too predictable, or is all too historical. Here is a map of the Japanese expansion. I believe I already showed these. I'll show it again. All right, you can show, here's the core of Japan, and you can see what happens in the Meiji's come into power. It was in 1868. And you can see just a few years later, they already take over a small acquisition. That's the Kuril Islands. Not much of an acquisition there. Nobody's suggesting a major amount of raw materials were acquired by that. It wasn't, but the Japanese are testing themselves in the imperial waters of the 20th century. And after that, 1876, look, they go down here, I believe, to Nansei Shoto, whatever, some more islands, a small acquisition. After that, you can see Iwo Jima, and then a substantial expansion, taking over the island of Formosa, which you now know is Taiwan, from the Chinese. That's a major bite. Soon thereafter, they would go up here to Korea and literally annex much of the peninsula in 1910. Annex means they said it no longer exists, it's ours. What the Japanese was, what we're doing, we're testing putting their toe in the colonial waters, see the reaction of the West, see how this is done. So you can see the Japanese expanding militarily. Then they got a break over here after that. In 1914, that's the beginning of World War I. So you have World War I in Europe. And of course, it's Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Let's not worry about it. Let's say it's Germany against the Western powers, the British and the French and the United States, including Russia. And of course, the Western powers are more than happy to give these colonies over here, which were German colonies, over to the Japanese. And so that's why the Japanese swallowed them up. And then look what happens. That's not the, World War I ends in 1918. What happens in 1929 is the Great Depression, the fall of the bottom falls out of the world economy. What happens when you have a recession? Economies or countries tend to contract economically. In other words, domestic producers saying, hey, we would like to have high tariff barriers to protect our domestic markets from competitors, because we want to make sure that Japanese, or whichever country you are, have to buy from Japanese producers. And so if we put high tariff or taxes at the border against foreign producers, that will protect our domestic market. All countries throw up tariff barriers during an economic recession. And so that's a problem for Japan, because Japan needs raw material resources, and all of a sudden it finds with the Great Depression, countries begin to throw up tariff barriers. It's harder to get into foreign markets to get the raw materials it needs. And so it's one thing that the Japanese desperately needed was coal, iron ore for its industrial base. It had none of this in Japan. And so you can see what happens. In 1929, the Depression starts, and what happens 2 years later, Japanese finds they're themselves industrially suffocating. They need resources. Now look what they do. They take a big bite out of China. Manchuria, remember, this is that portion of China that's got substantial industrial resources, especially with respect to coal and iron ore and some other critical things. So Japan takes a big bite out of China in 1931. The seizure of a large portion of China produces a second industrial zone in Japan. Remember, I said that the number one and premier industrial zone in Japan is the Kanto Plain. I talked about the topographical reasons for that. But what this trade with China produces after the Japanese seize it is a new secondary district of industrial production, and that's the Kansai district, often referred to as the Kinki district. But it's the Kansai district here, which is actually technically closer to China because you can access it on the inland sea over here. Every little bit of distance transporting large bulk products makes a difference economically speaking. So the point is, with the seizure of China in 1931, it produces a second industrial zone of importance in Japan, and that's the Kansai district. This is still the second most important industrial district in Japan. And you know historically what promoted it. All right. Now, once the Japanese had took a big bite out of China, that really brought the scrutiny of the Western powers in. Western powers have their problems in Europe, but it's especially brought the United States into the politics of East Asia, because the United States had a policy towards China called the open door policy, that any foreign power could trade and seek commercial opportunity in China. You can understand why the United States would have such a policy, because the United States was not one of the major European powers who got a concession in China, all right, in the previous century with the First Opium War. So the United States had an open door policy so that everybody can gain access to Chinese opportunity. Well, that pissed off the United States, that if everybody's supposed to be able to get access to China, the Japanese just took a big bite out of it for itself. Therefore, the outside powers like the United States wouldn't have access to it. Moreover, the Japanese very well may expand further and absorb the rest of China, which of course they would try to. And so therefore, in 1931, the United States says to the Japanese, we don't like this policy of you seizing up major resource peripheries for the industrial powers. And what the United States begins to do is put pressure on the Japanese to drop this military expansionist policy. The result of this is a little event that you know already, which I'll talk about in a minute.